You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is John Greenlee. John is a designer, horticulturalist, and expert in grass ecology. John is the author of the books The Encyclopedia of Ornamental Grasses and The American Meadow Garden. John designs roof gardens, living walls, and meadow gardens around the world. Thanks for joining me today, John. And can you tell our listeners what defines a meadow? What exactly is a meadow? Just so we know we're all on the same page.
Well, there really is no scientific definition. It has a French derivative. But a mead, a grassy panel. What really distinguishes meadow more from prairie is most meadows are really more cool season grasses than warm season grasses. Warm season grasses go completely dormant in the winter. Prairies are mostly warm season grasses, but meadows are combinations of grasses and grass-like plants that generally are composed of cool season grasses and grass-like plants. So, but you have a hard time getting an exact definition of what a meadow is.
And how much of the earth is covered in meadows, or was, I should say?
I have no idea, but I can tell you that grass ecology starts at the water's edge, along the ocean, and goes all the way into alpine situations. So wherever you are, there will be meadows and grass ecologies, as I prefer to call them, because some of these things are things that you can walk on, but generally where you find meadow grasses are usually places where people really want to be. Fertile, well-drained soil, forest openings, near water. Meadow ecology is generally the first to actually get turned into agriculture, which is why so little pristine meadow ecology actually exists anymore, no matter where it is on the planet. So, it's an interesting story. But interestingly, you can find little bits of remnant meadow ecology if you pay attention, and if you're really looking, pretty much no matter where you are, you'll be able to find the actual native components that used to compose meadows, whatever region you're in.
And you've created meadow gardens all around the world. And can you tell us why you are such an advocate for grass ecologies or grass ecology or meadows?
Well, there's a couple reasons. I mean, one is, if you've ever really spent time in nature and meadows, they're just drop dead gorgeous most of the time. As I said, they're generally places that you want to be, sunny and soft and very human friendly sort of thing. The other important part of it is why meadows, the question, why advocate meadows? And one of the major reasons is because lawns are so bad for the environment. The classic conventional mowed turf grass panel is a detriment to the environment. It's not a plus. For example, every single day in the 3-county Los Angeles basin, there's 22 tons of air pollution. Air pollution alone from mowers, blowers, and edgers. Quantifiable. 2-cycle engines are really the dirtiest. One weed eater or lawnmower does more pollution than I don't know how many cars. I mean, you can look it up online, but it's significant. And it's still the paradigm for a good American garden. Is a good lawn. And of course, we know now that lawns are not good. The trick is how we replace. What do we replace conventional turf grass with? And I think meadows have a lot to offer. And what I like to call meadow lawns, which can be both meadows and lawns. It has more to do with manipulating native and native adapted grasses to do what you want them to do from a design standpoint, so you can create art and have functionality, but not be destroying the planet while you're doing it.
And really, to remind listeners, and I'm sure that you know many of these reasons that the modern lawn is so detrimental to the environment, is the labor involved. You mentioned the air pollution and all the toxic chemicals that people apply to their
My
lawns.
God,
It's
yes.
huge.
No, if you show me the best lawn on the block, and I'll show you the most toxic piece of land on the block. It's dead serious. Like you can't in most cases have a good looking lawn despite the, rhetoric that you get from the quote green industry about how most of these lawns can be maintained organically. It's not true. It just really isn't true. And so anyway, it's yeah, the amount of chemicals, the amount of water, it's just incredible.
And the chemicals run off, which we're all very aware of, into our water, into the water down, especially in California, straight into
Right.
the street, right into the creek and the ocean. And so that's really bad for ocean life.
And yet, still the number one gardening product in America is lawn. So we really haven't learned our lesson in the way that we should, but it's changing as paradigms do, and slowly changing. And there's a lot of reasons for that, along with the understanding that people are now getting that you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. So you can't just keep making excuses as to why things aren't being done. And especially now, because we now, 10 years ago, even when I wrote the Encyclopedia of Ornamental Grasses, a lot of the plants that are available in the nursery trade now were not available then, back in 92 when I wrote that book. And now, and for example, the American Meadow Garden is now over 5 years old. There, some of my go-to grasses for the West Coast, like Lemus triticales lagunita, were not even in the nursery trade when I wrote that book. So I do talk about the benefit, or the possibilities of using creeping wild rye. But since that time, we've come upon a variety of creeping wild rye that's native to the West Coast, that's mowable. You can make a lawn out of it. It's native. It actually can take the place of a lawn and can be a meadow, meaning accessorized with flowers, bulbs, and flowering grasses to have it be more habitat than just a green rug.
And why would this, for people who are listening and think, okay, so I'm going to plant this rye in my yard, why is that less detrimental than the Kentucky
Because you're
bluegrass or
only,
the other grasses?
well, first off, it's native, so it's appropriate. Secondly, it doesn't need to be mowed the same number of times as Kentucky bluegrass. And you can leave it mowed or unmowed. So it's incredibly versatile that way. So the idea of, and creeping this particular grass, the Lamus triticales lagunita, absolutely appropriate for the West Coast where it's native from Baja, all the way up into Oregon, um, and sort of morphs into some related species in the Great Basin. Um, but there's an analog for it no matter where you're gardening. If you're gardening in Arizona, if you're gardening in Missouri, if you're gardening in Vermont, Florida, there are going to be native grasses that are adapted grasses that don't pose a threat to the native habitats that remain, that'll work. You just have to find them. So,
And on a quick aside, what do you think about the green plastic lawns that that are so popular in California right now? People think they're doing a great thing by putting those in.
well, they're going to find out it's a not so great thing. I see the value of them from a temporary standpoint. They are a chemical product. There have been studies showing that diseases and all kinds of evilness can lurk in the plastic lawn, and it still needs to be washed down and Oh my God. But, the biggest thing is, are we just decorating the planet or are we creating habitat? The selfish nature of our species is really just absolutely beyond frightening. So, covering the ground with concrete isn't good for the planet either, or asphalt. We now know that we can have paving that's permeable. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can harvest water. We can do all kinds of things if we partner with nature as opposed to decorating it. So
Exactly.
these are really important concepts, and this is why the meadow, what I call meadow gardening, has a lot to offer for essentially restoring the American landscape and a story.
The drought in California has really prompted a lot of people to rip their lawns out. And what I see happening, which is great too, is I see a lot of gravel and boulders in the lawn. And then I see the
Well,
pokey, pointy succulents, which are great. But when I think of a meadow, I think of the nice, soft, something you can lay on, take a nap.
well,
It's
it is interesting that the drought actually spurred a lot of reed landscaping, and rightfully so. But the crazy thing now is, written into a lot of CCNRs and city codes is you can't plant grass, and which is crazy unto itself because there's a lot of grasses that are drought tolerant that can make lawns. So now you can't even put a natural lawn sometimes on a plan without running afoul of some silly agency that is well meaning but actually pretty stupid.
and doesn't know enough about it to make that decision.
Right. So a lot of times it takes tough individuals to stand up and say, no, this can be done a different way. Or you can do what some of my clients do, which is wait, get signed off, and then do whatever it is you want to do anyway. I mean, when pennisetums are outlawed, only outlaws will have pennisetum. I don't know what to say. We're at a very strange um, place in environmental history of the planet in which there's truly a large segment that is xenophobic, or let's just say there's a zealotry for I understand and am a big and use a lot of native plants and whenever possible, but restricting complete use with the climate changing of things that aren't native is, I think, a fool's errand. A lot of people don't think that evolution, you can just turn back the clock to pre-European settlement, and guess what? Ain't so.
Well, what would we be? I mean, I think a lot of our favorite plants are
Well,
immigrant
there you
plants.
go. So my filter is, if you're not from the area of the garden that I'm making, you better be what I call a good garden citizen. You better be well behaved. You better stay where you're put. You best not invade or have even plants don't really invade, by the way. They really don't, despite what a lot of zealotry rhetoric is out there. Most problems with weeds happen because there's disturbance. And most people don't even understand weeds. And understanding weeds is a big part of being successful as a meadow gardener. I mean, that we'll maybe get to that later, but one of the most important steps of, creating a meadow garden is knowing the history of the area that you want to make a meadow. Did it used to be a lawn? And this is the most important thing because a lot of people now are like, hey, I read your book or I saw this beautiful meadow. Meadows are for me. And then how do I get from point A to point B? Well, the most important thing is what kind of grass was there before? Was it Bermuda grass? Because if it is, Bermuda grass is really difficult to get rid of. A big scourge of meadow gardens in the northern tier of the United States is a European weed grass, a Eurasian grass called Bromus inermis, which my good friend Neil DeBole from Prairie Nurseries in Wisconsin calls Bromus
Yeah,
enormous,
that's what I was
because
gonna say.
highway departments just basically raped the planet by whenever there were road cuts made by just throwing out bromus inermis. So now bromus inermis is just in the ecology. It's not going away, or at least it's not going away until Monsanto creates genetically specific weed killers, which I guarantee you somebody in a white lab coat in Missouri is working on. But that's another story for another day. But part of my value as a consultant is telling people what they had and helping them understand how to get from point A to point B. Maybe the old lawn is something that's easy to get rid of. Boom, that's the most important part of my consultation. If it's a noxious perennial weed grass, now we have to employ a strategy that gets us back to square one, or else we're going to end up with this mix of good guys and bad guys with no ability to discern or to, eliminate the bad guys from the good guys. But then America really as a whole, American gardeners are pretty illiterate when it comes to understanding disturbance ecology. Most American gardeners do not know the top 10 weeds of their area. They'll call Bermuda grass crabgrass. They just don't get it. And so a lot of times hiring a professional to tell you what you have is probably the best money that you can spend if you don't know what you have.
And don't the weeds tell you something about what's going on in your soil?
Well, they can. A lot of times, though, they tell you that, I'm the biggest, baddest guy on the block. So if you've if you've got a garden full of noxious perennial grasses, you basically have a bad neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to plant something else, and you're not going to get back to square one, you better plant something that's just as tough as the other guy down the street, and let them just fight it out.
So would you say it's important then, in most cases, to clear all the weeds out before you plant your meadow garden?
It's the most important step, and it's the step that a lot of people skip, and then that becomes part of the problem. Meadow gardening isn't necessarily low maintenance. A meadow that's really well designed and well put together might need as much editing and direction as a really sophisticated perennial border. The more things you add to the meadow, bulbs, perennials, annuals, somebody has to know the difference between the good guys and the bad guys. And you're also creating a plant community. So if you don't understand what one particular plant needs or what its growth habit is, then you're going to end up like Mickey and Fantasia. You're not going to know, you're not really going to be in control of what's happening.
So how would you suggest that people get started? And then I want to talk more about the plants that you would be planting here. So it's not a good idea to leave the weeds and then let them battle it out with the newly introduced.
No, probably not. Big thing being that, well, it all depends on what the weeds are. So, what's the real definition of a weed? The real definition of a weed is a plant out of place. So, if your weeds, with the addition of some more purposeful plants, can look like they belong, that they're in place, then guess what? They're not weeds anymore. They're part of the tenor of what's going on. Dandelions can actually be really beautiful. Veronicas, a lot of things that are considered the weeds in the lawn, depending on their growth habit, might be just fine as part of the components. But it really varies from region to region, and how you approach these things are, I talk about these things in my book, The American Meadow Garden. But getting back to square one is the most important thing. So there are inorganic methods of doing it. There are chemicals at work, like Roundup and or other kinds of herbicides. That there are other, if you're just absolutely anti-Monsanto, there are other chemicals that kill grasses that aren't Roundup. Suffice it to say, you can go online and there's a zillion organic methods, which include covering with plastic and baking the soil. Last time I checked, plastic is also a chemical. You can dig the top 8 inches of soil and haul it away. But of course, then you're also generating a pollution input, dragging that biomass someplace else, So these are, these are all esoteric questions. I find that the proper use of Roundup done properly is the last time you'll ever need chemicals again. And I know that's going to make a lot of people upset, but prove me wrong is fine with me. Baking sheet mulching does not get rid of a lot of noxious perennial weed grasses. Or let's just say it works, but you need to do it for a couple years. So if you want to be doing weed mitigation for a couple of years, my hat is off. I mean, congratulations. You get a big gold stars on your report card, but very few of my clients will allow that to happen. So, but there are methods of tilling things again and again and again, and so there's plenty of organic ways to do it. Everybody has to decide what their philosophies are from a standpoint of the use of chemicals. Um, I'm still experimenting with other ways to kill plants. I just I just tried some vinegar, some acetic acid on a little patch in my garden. So I'm playing around, but there you have it. Got to get back to square one.
And so you're in square one, so you have the no more noxious weeds coming up, whatever method you do.
Right.
Tell us about the plant palette, just a few of your
Well, let's go
favorite
back a little
plants.
bit
Yeah.
more though to
Okay.
soil preparation.
Oh, yes, yes,
You have
yes.
to prepare the soil, and I basically just loosen the soil to make planting of small plants, plugs, 4-inch pots, and gallon cans be facilitated by the soil more or less being friable, if you will. Do I try to improve the soil? No,
Hmm.
no, no. Rototilling, raping a peat bog in Canada, adding organic matter and tilling it into the first 6 inches of soil does absolutely nothing to the original soil that goes down for the next 3 feet. It's about planting things that say, thank you for planting me in this heavy clay. I couldn't be any happier. Trying to change it is old school. Trying to turn everything into chocolate cake, silt loam has been proven to be really pretty stupid. It's one thing if you're doing food production. That's another story. Go for it. Get maximum growth out of it. But you're much better off embracing what Scott Ogden and Lauren Springer call plant-driven design, which is you plant the plants that work in the region and the climate and the soils that you have. You do not try to change them. Now, that being said, one thing I do use usually is I put mulch on the surface after I've planted. So, and that mulch can be gravel, can be organic matter, and that's more about not letting weed seeds blow in, touch bare soil, because as you know, bare soil is the devil's workshop.
Mhm.
Nature fills a vacuum, and very sadly, hardly ever with what you want it to be. So those are our strategies. We'll get clean, we'll do our planting, and then we'll top dress with mulch. And that's our normal procedure.
And are you doing, and it sounds like you are, if you're doing the plant driven, the right plant, right place, you're really doing a site analysis where you're saying what will work here and will work
Yeah,
with what's here.
exactly. And that when you say work with it, I mean that has everything to do also, excuse me, with the style, the garden style and the architecture and what you're trying to achieve and what other plants are growing with it. Those sorts of things. So, when we finally get down to the aesthetics of it, then that's really where the fun begins. Plugging in when I say right, meaning things that grow well in your climate and your situation, but also play well with others, sort of thing, in sort of creating a more complex plant community, which is really what a meadow is all about. Meadows, the most glorious meadows that you see, whether it's like the kind of alpine meadow where Julie Andrews was twirling around, in the sound of music, or, you're in some wonderful forest opening. It looks really simple. There'll be little flecks of color, little bulbs and flowers and perennials blooming, and the grass will look like essentially one kind of grass, but usually in nature, it's a complex. What looks like one or two things is actually 30 things, and they're all interplanted and they read simple, but they're actually a very complex, dynamic, group of plants.
And do you try and choose plants that would grow together in nature, or are you kind of picking and choosing
Sure. I mean,
from
that's
different?
the easiest way to be successful which is the value of seeing plants in nature, is saying like, oh, I get it. When I see these heleniums, it's usually so many feet away from the stream and it's probably a little damper there. And it's like, okay, I'm going to look for the damp spot in my garden. I'm not going to put a sprinkler emitter there and get more water there. I'm going to say, okay, this is the place that's naturally damp, or in the winter, this is the wetter spot. I'm going to analyze the site and then I'm going to do things appropriately. Obviously, there are things you can do, little subtle tricks, like take an area that's basically level and scallop an area out. So what irrigation is provided, what rainfall does fall, there's a little bit more water retained in that depression. And so that's where you maybe put species side by side that need a little bit more moisture, things of that nature.
And does size matter with meadow gardens? Can you have, can you have, if you have a small suburban lot, is it possible to do this there?
Oh, sure. I mean, and that's probably where the meadow is absolutely more appropriate. 1,000 square foot lawn, which is, maybe the average suburban West Coast lawn is maybe somewhere between 500 to 2,000 square feet. I mean, to have to touch that 40 times a year with mowers, blowers, and edgers is really sort of insane. That's an awful lot of maintenance. Lawn is usually the least expensive thing to plant, and then it becomes the most expensive thing to maintain. So, yeah, taking what Wolfgang Ume, the very famous plantsman, part of the design team, Uma van Sweden, who were responsible for, if you were paying attention in the 80s and 90s, the quote, new American garden, the designers that actually really popularized grasses being used for ornament, not grasses just as lawn, but grasses for ornament, which was essentially the beginning of the use of the term ornamental grasses to sort of differentiate them from either turf grass or pasture grass. So at any rate, Wolfgang Ume called them silly lawns because they really are silly. It's so small, you can't play sports on them. So what's the reason? Now, interestingly, as a designer, I get what lawn does from a visual standpoint. It's a green panel for your eye to rest. Basically, one color, one texture, and it maybe juxtaposes the frivolity, the cacophony, the whatever of the perennial border or the borders that surround the lawn. So I get what that does, but why have it be something that you need to touch and does damage to the planet when maybe instead of that you could plant Sesleria autumnalis or Texas bluegrass, Poa arachnifera, or Sesleria Greenlee hybrid, or maybe Lamus triticioides lagunita. I mean, there's plenty of things that will make that green panel and be better for the environment, do everything that, quote, the lawn was going to do, and yet you're now a better ecological citizen.
Because you're really creating a mini ecosystem. It's much more biodiverse than just that one monocrop of green grass.
Precisely. And once you stop mowing, once you stop spending all your time chopping the life out of things, cutting off the flowers of the grasses. I mean, so many times I'd be talking with clients and what do you mean flowering grasses? And you have to realize that we're so programmed as a culture thinking about lawn, nobody thinks about the fact that you're cutting off the flowers of the grasses every time you're mowing the lawn, which is why Michael Pollan said grasses are, it's a very American thing because it's a plant that's completely been stripped of its sexuality. You know, you, you don't get to see the sexual parts anymore. You're just, cutting it off and then perversely getting it to grow
I
again
know
with
that's
water
what.
and fertilize, only to cut it off again.
Well, because grass grows more when it's grazed, right? So you're grazing the lawn with your mower.
Oh my God, it's a strange world that we live in. But anyway, you might find that actually looking at the flowers of grasses is actually a lovely thing. I mean, that being said, most of my best main I mean, when I'm putting a meadow together, first I try to come up with what I call the ground cover grasses. So this is going to be the main constituents of the meadow. It will be the highest percentage of componency. And in a small garden, in a little lawn conversion, it might just be one species. And they might be planted 12 inches on center from little tiny pots that are maybe probably shipped UPS to you because most of these smaller sizes are not available at conventional retail nurseries, certainly not available at the big, nasty box stores that have ruined American horticulture, but can now, interestingly, be ordered from design professionals and nurseries that do supply ground cover grasses. And so these go in as the main matrix. Maybe it is a matrix. Maybe it's 40% Lamus triticioides lagunita or 60% lagunita, and with drifts or individuals of Muhlenbergia dubia pine muley every 3 feet in drifts going through the lagunita. And these are the basic 1-2 components of the meadow when it comes to the grasses. Then the accessories, as I like to call them, or the meadow, essentially flowering accents, can then be in any category. It can be bulbs, they can be perennials, they can be annuals, combinations of all three. They can be planted from plugs, they can be planted from seed, they can be planted from gallon cans, and you're off. You got yourself a meadow.
And can you share with our listeners some of the benefits of these meadow gardens? We talked about how it's much more biodiverse. There's no bare soil, it sounds like. And also,
No,
I
I mean,
would. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
exactly. I mean, no bare soil and a much more beautiful setting. I mean, once you get into making meadows, then lawns start becoming relatively unsatisfying from a standpoint of they're just static. It's just one thing. Yeah, why not plant the plastic grass, right? I mean, really, truly.
Ugh.
You're not doing anything for the birds, bees, and butterflies. You are selfishly covering the planet for your own evil purposes, as opposed to, being a good garden citizen and having some place where birds, bees, butterflies, pollinators, and yeah, maybe some edibles. Maybe, maybe you've
Like your
added
other book.
some, right. My other book, the
Yeah.
Edible Meadow. You know what? I am fascinated because, as you know, gardening is a lot like fashion. So suddenly, what was hot in the '80s was perennials, and into the '90s, and then suddenly everybody started discovering pollinators. Now pollinators are the buzzword, and now you can find cooking shows on almost every cable channel, known to man. But the gardening cable channels have sadly, you know, there are just vacant of plantsmanship, and it's extreme home makeover, blah blah blah. But there's lots of focus on edibles. Why not poke in strawberries? Or I was doing some research on root herbs like salsify, and even there's, for example, a perennial called perdidia that is a Queen Anne's lace relative, a carrot family thing that the native Western Indians would dig along with camas bulbs. And it was an important starch and vegetable. Why couldn't you have edible meadows? And then one further thing we've been having fun with is, instead of planting a lawn, like kill the lawn, or here's even something you can do without, you just try to get back to square one, and then why not plant a little patch of oats or wheat? or barley and have a muffin lawn or a beer lawn or a bread lawn. It really doesn't take that much wheat to make a loaf of bread. And so you can enjoy the grass growing, you can enjoy it coming into flower, you can harvest and then have a big harvest party and a threshing party, and then have fun finding out just really how much work it was to make a loaf of bread 2,000 years ago. So I find it fascinating. So anyway, we've been having fun playing around with heirloom grains, grains that, interestingly, grains before they were, quote, improved. The wheat that's harvested, that's grown by the millions of acres in America, is nothing like the wheat that the Egyptians and the Iraqis, the Fertile Crescent, grasses native to the Fertile Crescent, which is why we got to all live together in cities, because we figured out how to grow these grains: corn, wheat, rice, barley, sorghum, that we might then work on making these edible gardens, edible lawns.
That would be, you could mow, instead of mowing, you could harvest.
We actually have the recipes for the beer that the Egyptians drank like 3,000 years ago. And it was more of a mead. It was actually like a honey and a barley precursor. And interestingly, a lot of these grains, before they were improved, they don't have the same gluten content. They have more of what you really needed out of grain and less of what's in grain today to make Wonder Bread. So, which when I was growing up built strong bodies 12 ways.
You get pasty white.
That tells you how old I am. Right.
Oh, and I've heard too that the gluten problems that people, the gluten intolerance that people are having, is from the increased gluten in the modern grains.
Yeah. So, why have a lawn at all when you could have a wheat field? I mean, good Lord, how much fun can that be? And so, how do you have to do it? You have to plant the seed every year. Big deal. There's a lot of dryland farming that can go on, that actually you sow the seed in the fall, it grows, it flowers, it sets seed, and you harvest it, and then you're looking at crispy brown stubble in the throughout the summer and into the fall. Well, then maybe you make another type of meadow that can be made is what the English call a cornflower meadow, which is actually just throwing out annual seeds every year. So every year you have this succession of flowers, daisies, and all kinds of components added to it. But it's not a, quote, stable ecology like a meadow would be. It's really more of a glorified annual planting. But so what? You every year in the fall have to cut down the stubble in the fall, till it up again, and throw down another batch of seed. We call that gardening. And a lot of Americans really don't garden. They just, it's not gardening what most of America does. It doesn't involve knowledge of plants and manipulations of plants. So there you go.
So you were mentioning how gardeners know nothing about gardening and they're terrible.
Did I say that?
Well, they're terrible gardeners.
Nothing.
Is it because people just go to the big box stores, buy the same plants over and over and stick them in the ground?
A lot of it has to do, really, you just have to look at 90% of the elementary schools across this nation. They have turf grass and shade trees. So we're really not bringing children up to garden. And a lot of people, the vast majority of Americans, are living in ecologies that they didn't grow up in. So people from California don't even understand, many people from California don't even understand true Mediterranean climate. Or people are gardening in Florida and they have no idea what Florida used to look like. A lot of which was pine savanna, which then turned into orange groves and now turns into lawn and clipped hedges from the orange groves. So most of us don't even know the history of the land of where we live. So that's what I mean when I say most American gardeners are illiterate. Really don't, they can't look at something and know that it's native, know that it's disturbance ecology, know where it's from, what part of the world, what it wants, how to get rid of it. So it's a real marker of where we are and how we got where we are, which we hope, I think the internet's, while the box stores might have been bad for America, turning plants into lost leaders and supplying things that need an IV stuck in them, that need fertilizers, waters, chemicals. They make their money. They can sell plants cheap because they can even guarantee them, knowing that you're going to kill them, because they know you're either too lazy to bring back the dead plants, or they're going to make their money selling you the chemicals that you need to, quote unquote, fix the problems of the things that you really shouldn't have been planting anyway. You know, so that's the state of gardening in America.
Well, it's like program for failure instead of
Yeah,
success. Yes.
pretty much.
One thing, too, that I think is really important for people to be aware of is that I would assume the meadow with all of the life and all of the roots of the grasses and the plants would really slow the water down from just running off into the street, especially in California where we have the dry season and then the wet season. Would you say that the meadow soil, does growing a meadow increase the soil fertility and also the sponge-like capacity of the soil to hold
Well,
the
sure.
water?
And the point is that, a lot of the real value of meadows and grass ecologies is essentially creating rain gardens and bioswales. Every parking lot in America should drain into a constructed wetland, go through a biofilter, plants that take some of the pollution out of the water before it then goes into the storm drains and into the creeks and into the gutters and into the bays and into the food chain. So again, this comes back to not just decorating the planet. So your driveway, you park your car on your driveway. Do you not know that gasoline and oil and chemicals drip from the bottom of your car? Do you know how much toxic material accumulates in a standard parking lot? And so what do we do right now? It just goes from curb to gutter to storm drain right into our system. So in fact, it just kills me. I'll see plantings in parking lots. I'm a huge critic of most parking lot planting. You could well imagine. It's as if people still haven't discovered shade trees. But the point would be that the gardens don't belong on mounds in parking lots. They belong in depressions that funnel the water into these depressions, and then they're planted with grasses and sedges and perennials and flowers that create beauty, but also have function. So bioswales, rain gardens, harvesting the water, having it move more slowly, but still recharging the aquifer. These are all things we have to be concerned about, or should be concerned about.
So you talked about maintenance, and I know we're getting close to the end, but you talked about how maintenance can be sometimes as high as a modern lawn. What do these plants, once you have your meadow installed or you hire you to put in your meadow, what do these plants need to thrive?
Well, I fertilize them to get them established, but once they're established, I rarely fertilize them ever again, unless if I do fertilize them again, it's after I cut them back. Most grass ecology in nature is either burned or grazed. So I highly recommend you consult local authorities before burning your meadow. But it isn't that hard to have your meadow, quote, grazed, which would really involve either goats or a weed eater or a good pair of hedge shears. I mean, if it's only 1,000 square feet, cutting back 1,000 square feet of meadow in a little tiny front yard is a once a year chore, generally in February or March, sometimes twice a year, even up to as many if it's being used as a meadow lawn, maybe 4 times or 6 times a year. It can be done with a variety of equipment, from hedge trimmers to weed eaters to, as I said, hedge shears, just cutting it back to anywhere between 1/3 to half of the volume of what the grass is. So you got to cut it back to keep it looking good.
You don't want to do a controlled burn, at least in California.
Well, I mean, it's sad. Burning actually is, a lot of our meadow plants are programmed to burn. They want to burn, they need to burn. And of course, this has a lot to do with why a lot of grass ecology is disappearing, because even you can't just put a fence around grass ecology. You have to preserve this grass system, which generally involves burning or grazing. In the prairies, it was buffalo and fire. In the Great Central Valley, it was elk and things of that nature. And it pays to, try to mimic the native systems whenever possible.
And then one last ecosystem service I wanted to talk about. Grasses have a high capacity to fix excess atmospheric carbon through their long roots. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, sure. I mean, grasses basically, Carl Forster called grasses the hair of the earth. I mean, it's just, for me, a garden without grass, a succulent garden that's all succulents is a succulent ghetto. I prefer to have some grass componency in just about all the plantings, that I do, whether they become a meadow when the grasses become the dominant componency of the plantings. So you can go from border to meadow to actual lawn that way. But there's definite benefits to planting grass.
And John, to close the interview, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to share with listeners today?
Don't be afraid to get trained professionals to, a lot of times you're going to have to do a little bit of research, and it might bring you to wholesale growers that aren't going to want to do business with you as a retail customer. But chances are really good, if you're a squeaky wheel, they'll refer you to contractors and designers that do shop with them. And with a little bit of research, you're bound to find professionals to work with. And so sometimes it's just as getting started is finding a professional, getting an initial consultation, and making sure you're on the right road to being successful. As a shameless plug, I would recommend that you visit our website and definitely check out the American Meadow Garden. I think is a good primer for starting meadows. But there's some other great books. I do like Scott Ogden and Lauren Springer's Plant Driven Design. Has a lot of great information in it. And I would tell you that with a little bit of research, you'll find out where to get those plants and how to get them.
And where can people find you online?
Sure. We're Greenlee and Associates. You can email us, greenleeandassociates@gmail.com. We do horticultural consulting, garden design, and plant acquisition. So people call us to find plants for them. Part of our skill set is that we know nurseries across the nation that grow the kinds of things that make the gardens that we're interested in. So if your folks need plants, you give us a call, email us a plant request, and we'll see what we can do to hook you up with the plants you're looking for. We're doing a lot of consultation now from people just actually sending us images and buying, consultation. People can send us cell phone images of what their garden looks like, and a lot of times it's a really simple answer that we can help you with. But let us know if we can help. We'd love to help. We can maybe, if you're not in our region, we might have some names for you of some people in your region for you to contact.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
Sure. All right. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.